So I'm just checking in to see if everybody can hear me and see my screen. If somebody can shoot me a message back and let me know they can do that, I'd appreciate it. Can you guys see my screen? Anyone? Can you hear me? All right, got it. Thank you guys. We're just going to give it another minute here and then we'll get started. All right, on my watch, it's 11 o'clock, so we'll start the webinar. And today we're going to talk about auditing requirements for products and services, formerly known as contract review in the parlance of the old standard. We scheduled this for an hour, but it'll probably take about 35 minutes. And as always, if you have a question, please write it in. I'll answer all the questions after the webinar's over. We have one polling question at the very end, so a question from me to you. And then we'll issue the certs after this and post the video. So let's get into it. We like to, it's been a while since we've done one of these webinars. The last one we did was on design and APQP. And so we like to reinforce the DQS quality policy. We want to do process-oriented audits, and certainly through the course of this, I'm going to talk about input, process, output, and measurement as it relates to the function of contract review. And with apologies, I'm going to refer to it as contract review. That's what I grew up learning it as, and most of you know it that way anyway. We like to focus on the effectiveness of the management system and generate benefits, value for the customer, remembering that in the parlay of TC 176, generating value is making sure you cover all the requirements and note nonconformances where we find nonconformances. And we want to make sure we issue internationally respected certificates, again, covering the requirements and doing adequate sampling. So we're going to talk about all that stuff through the course of this presentation. So one way of thinking about contract review, and it's probably the best way of thinking about it, is to picture the organization as just basically a process. So it has to get inputs, it does something, and then it has outputs, which are the products and services that it ships. And through the course of this presentation, I'm going to focus mostly on products, but it would all be applicable to services. So when we're trying to understand the importance of contract review with relationship to customer satisfaction, which is what the standard is all about, you have to ask yourself this: how can the organization ensure it meets customer requirements if it doesn't know what they are? And so that's why this clause is so important. And I'll be honest with all of you, I do not like auditing contract review. It's an admin clause, but that does not mean it is not super important. If you don't understand the requirements up front, you have very low chance of meeting them. Secondarily, if you knew what the requirements were, let's say they collected all the right stuff, but they didn't have it reviewed by the right people. So they didn't have it reviewed by operations for capacity, purchasing for buying whatever widgets are needed to make the end item, design engineering in the case of non-catalog product. What is their chance that they're going to be able to comply with the customer's requirements? Again, very low chance, makes it a high-risk operation. Some key indicators of potentially bad contract review would be poor on-time delivery, possibly customer complaints or RMAs and rejects. So I'm going to say this now, and I'm going to say it again throughout the presentation. Before you go into contract review, you want to understand what the on-time delivery performance is. Now, contract review, the processes related to it, sales, marketing, by itself might not be a generator of poor on-time delivery, but there should be some reaction that we're seeing there. So think of it this way. If you're going into an organization, let's say their on-time delivery is 50% on time. Let's agree that that's bad, okay? You go in there and you ask them, okay, how do you know that you can meet the customer's lead time? And they go, well, we have a standard lead time of 2 weeks. You go, okay, well, how long have you had that standard lead time? Well, we've had that lead time for 2 years, Dave. Now you already know that they're 50% on-time delivery. What's your impression of a system that continues to give the same lead time, even though they know that more than half the time they're not making the customer's delivery date? Your impression should be, this is a fairly ineffective system. And that's why understanding some of these kind of higher level metrics before you walk into contract review, the same could be done with complaints, depending on the nature of complaints, a little harder. But certainly on-time delivery is one that you can take with you into the process and go, this is a measure of the effectiveness, at least in part, of this process. And again, I think we could agree there are many things that could affect on-time delivery: the operation, the ability to get the design out, the ability to get through APQP, shipping. There's lots of things. This is an indicator. So you wouldn't want to default right to, oh, you've got bad on-time delivery. That means your contract review process is bad. You need to ask those questions and kind of go through that logical sequence to say, okay, if we have bad time delivery, is it bad on-time delivery? It's because we're agreeing to something we can't do, or what are we doing if we know about this? What's our reaction to poor on-time delivery when we're considering customers' lead times? I tend to get ahead of myself, but I'm going to kind of back up a little bit. When I was making this presentation, I was like, well, how do I characterize organizations for you in a way that's going to be easily presentable in 30 minutes to an hour? So there are infinite number of organizations in terms of how they handle product, how they handle requests. I decided that essentially I would break it down to 2 organizations: providers of catalog product and providers of non-catalog product. So catalog product, the design's already done, right? So you go in, a lot of times the orders come across on a website, somebody will place their order. It's like Amazon Books is a provider of catalog products. They're not designing anything, they're not writing anything. They have a website. You go pick a part number, you tell them how many you want, there's a delivery date. Catalog provider. So in many cases, there won't even be a quoting process. But let's say for our purposes here, there is a quoting process. So a request for quote would come in, and you'd have an interface primarily with production and purchasing for the scheduling of the product. So why those 2 people? Well, production, obviously it has to do with capacity. Purchasing, most of the businesses, and again, I'm focused more on product here, we're buying things. So the lead time of the purchase parts influences the delivery date. A quote would be communicated, order would be received, there should be some sort of review. There's not a standard requirement for this, but normally, again, this is a anecdotal organization here, what we normally see, you would take a quote, review it against the order, see if there's any differences, and then try and resolve those differences. Normally, orders are accepted and acknowledged. Again, acknowledgement is not an ISO requirement, so if you're writing people up for not acknowledging their orders, you're doing something outside the standard. Again, in this type of business, the product requirements are already defined. The focus is on, can we meet the delivery requirements? And they tend to have less concerns about risk, lower risk business. The second type of business is catalog. So it's a little bit more complicated. So we receive a request for a product. The first step is to determine whether it's feasible. And now you have an interface with your engineering department. And maybe it's feasible with some exceptions or changes. Maybe it's not feasible. It's not something we do. So there's a no quote for the customer. Or maybe it's completely feasible and we're going to quote. So either way, there's this new step here because we don't know what the product is. We're going to design it. And so if there are any exceptions, they're either made via assumptions in the quote or the proposal made back to the customer, or they're done where you would communicate, they would communicate back to the customer what exceptions they want to take, and the customer would have to accept those. Quote goes out, and quote in these cases, and I saw some AS folks on here or some people that work with large contracts, you're going to understand that the quotes in these cases can be very extensive. There can be many terms and conditions. There could be a lot of design activity. There's not a requirement to have a full design, but there's a requirement to have, or there's a need to have enough to know that the product is feasible. An order would be received, and now we have an interface with design, purchasing, and operations on capacity and build. So design is going to be, okay, now we're going to know more about the requirements because now we've got an order. So that an order is a contract, or will be a contract when we agree to it. We have more of an idea of what the design is going to be and how long it's going to take us, probably more of an idea of the potential bill of materials. So that's SCM, and ops would be involved with the APQP and the build process. We will review the quote versus the order, again, go through this little progression on resolving the differences, and then order acceptance and acknowledgement. Again, in this non-catalog type providers, the emphasis is much more on product technical assessments and requirements. So it's much higher risk, and you should expect to see some risk assessments or see at least some acknowledgement of risk when you go in here. Now, I'm talking about nominal organizations. They might not do it. Can you make them do it? No, you can't make them do it, but you can ask some questions about how they handle risk, how they handle technical risk, how they identify it. For example, when I worked with Northrop for major proposals, actually for all proposals, we would do a risk and opportunity register, and we would do something called an S-curve, which I'll talk about later in the presentation. Now we got our two types of businesses, and again, there's many other permutations that I haven't addressed here. Let's talk a little bit about requirements. And I don't typically do this during these presentations, but I thought it might be worthwhile to break this down a little bit and go through what the actual requirements are. So starting in 821, they have to provide information on products and services. How do people normally do this? They have catalogs, they have websites, they have capability statements, they have a process for handling inquiries, contracts, orders. That's basically what you're auditing. So there's nothing special for you to do to confirm 821 A and B really are in place. Now you see some weirder type requirements. They have to obtain customer feedback, including complaints. Well, there's an interface there to customer satisfaction, and certainly to clause 10.2, where it has customer complaints. They have to have handling or controlling of customer product. We know in 853 it says if customer product is lost or damaged, they have to identify that back to the customer. And they have to establish specific requirements for contingency actions when relevant. What does that mean? Maybe they have outsourcing agreements. Maybe they have dual sourcing for key suppliers or for the product itself. There's possibly some interface to 7.13. So these are things you might cover at other parts of the audits and basically see if you're auditing a sales or marketing function in interface from somewhere else in the organization through sales and marketing back to the customer for communication. Okay. Trouble getting my screen to change. There we go. So next we're going to get into the meat of the requirements. So they have to determine the requirements, and requirements are defined including statutory and regulatory. That's what our little S&R is up here, and you're going to see that a few times because this clause really focuses on the identification of statutory and regulatory requirements. What are typical examples? Delivery dates, quantities, price, part numbers for catalog, and you can read the list. I gave you kind of some examples here of safe product safety, military spec requirements, REACH, RoHS. And then here we got customers' T's and C's. Contract review, the process itself, is a good place to identify customer flow down of requirements into the organization. So while you're looking through these contracts, generally you can maybe be able to do this at the quote phase. It depends on how complicated the quote is. Certainly for very complex products, they'll have the T's and C's included up front. At the order phase, customers will flow down their T's and C's and any customer specific requirements. So when you're doing this sampling, take a look at it. And what I do is I scan through the T's and C's. I don't read them all. I read some of them. And let's say I read one that says, you must comply with the conflict minerals requirement. I've got it on the next page. I didn't put it on this one. I would ask them, okay, I see that this says here you have to comply with the conflict minerals requirement. How do you do that? So I don't pick on all the T's and C's. I go through and pick a few, and maybe I'll ask some questions about it. The reason I do that, and the reason you should do it, is because you want to make sure organizations are looking at the terms and conditions when they're as part of their contract review prior to acceptance of the order. They become part of the contract. They're legally binding. So doing a bad job reviewing terms and conditions, and many organizations do a bad job reviewing terms and conditions, really hurts them. So if you want to add value to your customer, you can point it out to them through the exercise of, hey, look at this term and condition. How do you meet it? And then when you get kind of the crickets in response, well, you got a couple possible nonconformances, one related to not meeting customer requirements in a terms and condition, one related to potentially bad contract review process. The other thing you want to look for in contract review is those customer specific requirements. So these will come in, the contracts will come in, the orders will come in, and they might reference SQA type requirements, or they might have a website where the SQA type requirements are. Identify those. You want to use those later in your audit. So if I'm in there auditing contract review and I look at a Rockwell Collins contract to a supplier, and I know I scan through it and I go, oh, it's got requirements for packaging and shipping. Either when I'm out in packaging or shipping, or my co-assessor is, we want to make sure we try and sample some of those customer specific requirements. What we, I'm losing my voice, sorry. What we really want to do is make sure we see the flow down of those requirements through the organization. So as you're sitting here with your sales, marketing, whoever it is that you're auditing as part of contract review, this is where you ask them, I see that you get these customer specific requirements. Who reviews these? How do they get flowed through the organization? It's a perfectly legitimate question to ask, and the question you should ask. Again, this is a place where organizations don't do a real good job. So if you want to add value, you want to hit on this sort of thing to make sure they understand the importance of it. These are requirements. They're once they agree to it, it's basically part of the contract. Okay. So now they have to conduct a review before committing to supply the product. And that review needs to review the specified requirements. I list them all here. I put a couple extra ones there for you. Unstated but necessary for the intended use. I put a few things here, and we're going to whole chart on the next chart where we're going to talk about unstated but necessary for the intended use. Requirements that are internally specified. Well, what does that mean? So I'll give you an example. In Northrop Grumman, when we would take contract in and do an evaluation, we would evaluate the profitability. If it was below a certain number, we would no quote it. If we didn't think we could win the job and make a certain profitability number, that's an internally required requirement. Statutory and regulatory requirements. Now you've heard this again. You've seen it on the previous page. You've seen it here. And again, this is where the standard, I think Mike likes to say it's referred to 12 times in the standard. So there's 2 of the 12. Contractor order requirements differing from those previously expressed. In clause 8.2, there's at least 3 references to changes to requirements. And what they're talking about is a quote comes in, do a quote back, now something changes. How does that change get handled? Or an order, a change happens during the order phase. An order comes in, we're doing contract review of the order, now another change comes in. This happens more with the non-catalog business than it will with the catalog business. In the catalog business, what's changing is typically not anything to do with the product design, because it's catalog, but with maybe delivery dates or lead times. With the non-catalog business, it can be a lot of changes. You could be changing drawings, interface control documents, specs. We're going to talk about that in a minute. I have a chart on changes. But you need to be aware of this because, as we talked about during the design presentation, the place where organizations typically get bit isn't with a new product that's going all the way through. It's with when changes are starting to be introduced to the system while something is going through the process. Requirements must be confirmed prior to acceptance. Acceptance is at the order phase, not the quote phase. So if you're looking at a process where they're doing both quotes and orders, be aware it's the order phase. You want to see the confirmation of the requirements. I promised a chart on not stated by the customer, but necessary for specific or intended use when known. So I found this picture of Mr. Brannick trimming his hedges on the weekend. Is that an intended use for a lawnmower? No, not really. Is it potentially something that would be known? No, not really. So the thing you have to keep in mind here is that the organization has no obligation to ask. These are the key words, when known. This is more likely to be identified in non-catalog products. Okay, so if people are buying things over a website, there's no way the organization is really going to be able to know what they're using it for. An exception might be something like this. Everybody who's used a screwdriver has probably used that screwdriver as a chisel. Is that the intended use of a screwdriver? No. Do manufacturers of screwdrivers know that people use them as chisels? Yes, because everyone does it. So their knowledge of how their product gets used is something they factor into its design. But in non-catalog products, you have a lot of back and forth. And that back and forth is a process of discovery, especially when we're designing something that's complex. So during that, the organization may learn about a potential use of something and now have to, comply with this clause. It's a not stated by the customer, but necessary for the specific and intended use. So here is an example, a real life example. Again, I was buying ePLARS radios. An ePLARS radio is a 5-watt radio used by the Army and the Marine Corps. And so I went to Raytheon, it was Raytheon I was buying them from, and said, hey, I want to buy 23 of these radios, but I want connector X on them instead of connector Y. And Raytheon is really smart. And they go, oh, are you planning to put them on a high flyer because they aren't rated for altitude? Well, how did they know that? Well, they knew it because I specified a connector that was used in an Air Force application, not typical used to an Army or Marine Corps application and used on high flyers. Raytheon does tons of aerospace business. So they knew something. It's a non-stated requirement. And they pushed back to me, hey, what about this requirement? And for the rest of the story, it was a directed buy. And so basically they helped me because I was able to go back to my customer who said, hey, I want you to use these ePLARS radios, and say, I'll use them, but I'm taking exception to the warranty because they're not rated for altitude. So unless you want to qualify them for altitude, which costs this much, we're not going to warranty them, which of course they did, and I added it into my contract. So there's value that was added by Raytheon to me by being able to disclose this as something I had not thought of. Okay, so continuing with the requirements, and hopefully those examples, I'm sorry, I'm going to back up for a second. This will come up in questioning sequence all the time. People will say, well, how do I know this? How you ask them? And so if they're doing non-catalog work, if they're doing design work, I assure you, if they're doing any reasonable amount of design work, they're going to have some story or some example where they went back and forth with the customer and they identified some other requirements that were not stated and they became part of the contract. So you ask them, hey, has this ever happened to you? And then they'll give you examples. Engineers love to talk about this type of stuff, so it's easy to find examples of it. All right, back to the requirement. 8232 basically says we have to have records. What are records? Quotes, orders, acknowledgments, proposals, contracts. Entries into an ERP system can be defined as a record. And then I mentioned this already previously, but We have yet another instance where this clause is talking about changes. The organization shall ensure relevant document information is amended and persons made aware of changed requirements. Could be changes to the quote, could be changes in the order phase, could be post-acceptance of the order. How did the changes get handled? So you want to ask them, do you have any examples where you've done an order, you've submitted it back to the customer, and now they're starting to change a requirement? Can you show me how those are processed? You want to pay particular diligence, or want to make sure you really hit the changes hard. This is probably one of the most missed clauses when we go through our report reviews and we look for coverage of the clauses. Very seldom do we see people asking about changes. It's disheartening. It's disheartening because we all know, as I mentioned previously, that generally where problems occur is where there are changes. And I understand why it gets missed, because we're going through and we're sampling, and most of the sample we pull, or almost all the sample we pull, is going to be just those kind of orders that go right through, right? So we pulled them, they had a quote, they had an order, everything's good. And so you get through with your sampling and you're done. But are you really done? I mean, have you really exercised the system unless you ask some questions about this? And so I'll always ask, and you should ask when you're done with that sampling, if you haven't found one where a change has occurred, or a couple where a change has occurred, say, hey, have you ever had any instances where you've accepted a contract and now you have this change? It's a very easy question to ask, and they're going to know it, and they're going to direct you to some examples that you can check, and you can make sure the process is effective in verifying those changes with the right people prior to agreement to accept the order with those changes. I like to leave you guys with some questioning sequences. This is a questioning sequence I use. You can use whatever sequence you want. I'm not going to talk about all of them. I like to do a little intro. I tell them what I'm there for. I tell them what I want to look at. And I start with, hey, can you walk me through the process? Maybe we can start with a quote. Again, the sequence you actually face this is going to be different based on catalog product versus non-catalog product, because that non-catalog product is going to take you down it's going to take a little bit longer. It's a much longer road because the input is going to involve a lot of different drawing specs, interface control diagrams, documents of external origin, if you want to use that terminology, that you're going to need to maybe take a look at some of those requirements and see how they were reviewed. Next, you walk through what's the minimum information you need to do a quote or to accept an order, depending on what their process is. If you don't get the information you need, what do you do? In some cases, customers will make assumptions. Those assumptions will be fed back in the quote. In other cases, they'll ask for exceptions or they'll ask for more information. How do you identify statutory and regulatory requirements? So for non-catalog products, this is pretty much always going to be in play. For catalog products, maybe it's going to be shipping, maybe some packaging if there are specifications like that, and there might not be any of that. Red highlight, that means it's something important, or it means it's something we haven't been doing. And this is where I drew your attention right off the bat to not only understanding lead times, but understanding the terms and conditions and looking for those SQA flow downs first and foremost. We want to add value. That's what we're there to do. We're there to make sure we cover the requirements. This is part of the contract, so you need to make sure that they understand that and that it's supposed to be reviewed prior to acceptance. Also, I mentioned it right off the top. Know that on-time delivery KPI before you go in there. If you can't know customer complaints, that's fine. It's great if you could, but if you can't, at least know the KPI for on-time delivery before you walk in there so that you can judge the effectiveness of the system, which is essentially what we're doing. Okay. You'd ask some questions about reviewing quotes to orders. You ask for evidence of review prior to acceptance. You want to see some examples. Now you're going to ask for KPIs. Again, I mentioned before on-time delivery. Well, on-time delivery, it's kind of a higher level KPI, right? Because contract review is part of it, but so is design, APQP, purchasing. There's a lot of functions, manufacturing, of course, that play with the on-time delivery. So you might see some more pertinent to the process itself of sales or marketing, which could be order entry accuracy, order errors, quote turnaround time, order turnaround time. Those are more specific just to the process of contract review. In non-catalog business, certainly you can ask this for catalog business, but in non-catalog business, you want to make sure you drop that question on risk. Okay, so you're getting these big contracts in where we're doing big design projects. Do you do any sort of risk assessment of these proposals or these orders? And in large organizations, they'll probably have a risk register. They'll probably have an S-curve, something where they relate risk to cost. And lastly, you're going to do some sampling. Now you've walked through a whole process with maybe one example. You say, hey, I want to look at some older records. I always tell them I'm going to go through 8 quotes and 8 orders. If everything is cool, we'll stop there. If it's not good, I might have to pull a few more just to make sure we have an effective system. So don't forget, we want to do that sampling so that we're adding the value. And kind of in summary, the thing to keep in mind when you're doing this process is this is the input to the organization. And it's super important that they understand the requirements and that they have a way of reviewing them that's holistic, not just some guy in customer service reviewing them, but something that considers all the requirements that have to be reviewed and the knowledge base that's necessary to review those requirements adequately. So maybe some guy in customer service is enough to review requirements in a catalog product, but maybe it's not. Maybe we need somebody from engineering. Maybe we need somebody from production or purchasing or some other functional. If we can't get the requirements identified, if we can't get them adequately reviewed, we, the organization in this case, have little to no chance of actually delivering a product that will satisfy the customer. That's why this clause in this process itself is so important. So with that, I'm going to let you go. I'm going to do, hang on, I'm going to do one more thing before I let you go. We're going to launch one little poll here. So hang on a second. It's an easy one. Okay, you should be seeing it now. There you go. Give you about a minute to go ahead and answer the poll questions. We got about 75, 80% have voted now. Just going to leave it for about 15 more seconds. We're almost to 100%, folks. This is great. All right. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, closing. So the answer to the poll was all of the above, and 93% of you accurately got that answer. A couple people picked the changes process, which is one of the things you would have to look at, and I'm glad that people at least paid attention to that piece of the presentation. Now that we're done, I'm going to ask if you have any questions, either write them in. Some people have written them along. Send me an email. And if there's a topic you want to see covered in one of these webinars, please send me an email and ask me what you want. I'll probably do 2 more webinars through the rest of the year. With that, I'm going to let you go, and thank you for your attention. Search will be out later this week. Thanks, guys.